Hi there, everyone. Good morning. Those of you in the U.S. time zones, good afternoon for colleagues joining from elsewhere. We're delighted to have you all here for today's webinar. We've had a great turnout of our People-Centered Accelerator members, and on behalf of the Secretariat, me and Hannah here in Washington, D.C., we're just very pleased that you could be here today for this first in our webinar series. Those of you who were with us at our annual meeting back in June heard a bit about this, but we're kicking off this webinar series in response to your feedback, the request for a chance to do some deeper dives into some subject areas that are of interest, of shared interest to all of us. And so you're the lucky ones who are part of this inaugural webinar. I will just note from a technical housekeeping perspective, this is a bit of a trial run for us with the Zoom webinar software. We're transitioning from a different platform. So just thank you in advance for your patience with any technical frustrations, but put them in the chat box and we have people who will do their best to help address those. So we're building out the schedule for webinars for the rest of the year. And this is something we also have thought of from the Secretariat perspective as something we can offer members as kind of a perk of membership. So we really think of this as it's intended for a People-Centered Accelerator audience. And that also creates sort of a feeling of community, right? You kind of know who you're asking questions of, and there's kind of that sort of background of relationships that makes it easier to be really candid and kind of ask what feels like maybe not the smartest question, but one that's really been on your mind. So just one of the benefits of this great coalition that we have. As for today's topic, you've probably heard the buzzwords around gender smart investing, gender lens investing. You've seen that our work streams within the Accelerator tackle last mile energy access, inclusive finance, and women's empowerment. And we are, wherever possible, trying to integrate those. And so in many ways, kind of gender lens investing feels to be at the very center of all of those things where they come together. So no surprise that there's a lot of interest in this. You're also probably aware that the numbers are quite low, kind of shockingly low, for the percentage of total investment that flows to women-led firms. It seems to be something that the world is waking up to, and the numbers are beginning to change. So there's a bit of momentum behind this conversation. But we couldn't be more lucky than to have our partners at Calvert Impact Capital joining us here for this discussion today. They've been leaders in this impact investing space, not to mention the gender lens investing space, and they can help shed some light on how investors think about gender equality, women's empowerment, and how they go about supporting those things that are important to all of us here. They recently put out a great report called Just Good Investing: Why Gender Matters to Your Portfolio and What You Can Do About It. Obviously aimed at an investor audience, but as a non-investor myself who's read it, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's just a really good read, in addition to being about just good investing. And so we'll hear a little bit more about that, I think, from our presenters today. So that's a nice transition over to our two colleagues from Calvert. So we have Nayada Kambuli, the Director of Investments at Calvert Impact Capital. And she specializes in renewable energy, financial inclusion, and she's led several investments focused on women's empowerment, access to finance, and climate change, and has experience leveraging investments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So really quite a wealth of experience. And then Lee Moran is Calvert's Director of Strategy. She leads a team around strategy, communications, and impact. She focuses on sharing Calvert's research and knowledge and developing strategies around impact, one of which is gender equity. She and Nayada are both authors on Just Get Investing. I kind of think of them as our friends in the business. So we're really fortunate to have them both as part of the People-Centered Accelerator Coalition family, and we're also just so fortunate that they've been willing to take their time today to tell us what they know. And so without much further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to them. We'll allow about 15 to 20 minutes for kind of presentation of the content they've prepared. And then the remainder of the time will be for questions and answers. And that will take place through the chat box. So don't be shy, send us your questions and we'll get through as many as we can. Over to you, Dee and Nayada.
Wonderful, thank you, Caroline. This is Lee from Calvert Impact Capital. And Caroline, just real quick, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you again for hosting us, and thanks to all the People-Centered Accelerator members for joining us for the webinar and for the work that everyone is doing in making sure this conversation and the topic of ensuring that the energy revolution gets to everyone. We're really appreciative to be a part of groups like this in the industry that allow us to have these conversations and expand our own network. So thank you for that. And with that, I'll just give a brief overview of how we're going to go through this. Caroline said we have a good amount of slides, but we're going to keep the presentation to only about 20 minutes, maybe less, so we have time for a more robust conversation. And as Caroline said, our focus today really is, and maybe we can skip to the next slide, really on incorporating gender into your investment strategy and sort of demystifying the idea of gender lens investing. Caroline said, Nayada and I do come from an investor perspective, but we've adjusted our presentation a bit, and again, hope that our perspective is helpful in understanding an investor's perspective, particularly private market investors' perspective. So that can be useful for all of your work, whether you're working alongside investors or trying to raise capital yourself. So with that, what I will do is go to the next slide. And again, just to provide some context for the conversation, give a really brief overview of who we are at Calvert Impact Capital. We are a almost 25-year-old nonprofit impact investing firm. And what we do is we raise money from investors, from individual investors, from institutional investors, from financial advisors. We take that money, we pull it, and we invest it around the globe in opportunities that have an intentional social and environmental, as well as a financial return. We invest mostly in other intermediaries and funds. So you can almost think of us like a fund of funds, not so much as a direct investor. We have exposure all around the globe. About half of our portfolios in the US, half in emerging markets around the world. We invest across 9 sectors, from affordable housing, small business, obviously renewable energy, microfinance, and sustainable agriculture. But again, we're focused on impact at hand. We're actually relatively sector agnostic. The really unique thing that we do, again, is sort of how we raise money. We can raise money both from individuals with as little as $20 online, up to institutions with, you name it, $20 billion. And then we'll go to the next slide here. The way that we raise money is really through 2 channels, or through 2 products and services, I should say. The community investment note is how we raise the bulk of our capital, which is a fixed income product like a corporate bond. And again, it's quite easy to purchase and is uniquely wired into the capital markets, so we can work with financial institutions, financial advisors, and a real range of investors that allows us to tap into a very diverse investor pool. About a year ago, we launched our syndication services that is available for accredited investors, and this provides a more specific exposure to individual deals as opposed to buying, a part of our entire portfolio like the note. But let's go ahead and skip on from that. And any other questions about Calvert, we're happy to offer as well. And this slide really is just, again, to provide a little bit more context about where we're coming from. We sit really as a market-facing intermediary, what we call a market-facing intermediary. Again, so we are raising money from investors by really interfacing with a lot of the gatekeepers for them, where investors put that capital. Financial advisors, financial institutions, we're solving for things like liquidity, risk and return, volume, diversification. But again, we offer products that allow investors to access to invest with us. And then we invest into community-facing intermediaries. And again, these are the intermediaries that I mentioned. They are really solving for needs in communities on the ground. And when we say global communities, we're really talking about communities that have been sort of left behind or overlooked by traditional finance, so don't have a lot of access to bank capital, et cetera, et cetera. And so why don't we head to the next slide? Excellent. And again, just putting this in a little bit of context of sort of who we're working with and where a lot of the money comes from, in both in that we're raising from, and that and money comes from an impact investing today, to give you a sense of sort of the scale of capital. A lot of things that we talk about, both in gender lens investing and impact investing more broadly, is about getting to scale and raising scaled capital. As you can see from this framework here, most of the scaled capital really lives over in that big gray bubble with investors, and it lives behind a lot of those gatekeepers like in advisors and institutions. So it requires products that have sort of distribution to be able to tap into those markets. But as you can see, people who have a little bit more discretionary capital, private investors, people like development finance institutions, maybe foundations, et cetera, can go sort of directly into community-facing intermediaries and skip over market intermediaries like this. But again, this is really just to set the context for sort of how money would move from an investor to global communities, specifically how we move it and where the vast majority of capital lives. So we'll skip on again to the next slide. Excellent. So Nayada will go into a little bit more detail about specifically our gender lens strategy and how it's involved. But before we even do that, I just want to, define how we use gender lens investing. And as Caroline mentioned, there's, people define it in a few different ways, but we really track along to the GIMS definition, which is defining gender lens investing as, investment strategies that are applied to a portfolio, which examines gender dynamics, takes in gendered information to better inform investment decisions and or intentionally and measurably address gender disparities. So just using gendered information to make better investments and or to do it to affect particular gendered impacts and outcomes. And really, again, as I think the name makes clear, it's a lens, right? It's something that you look through that's supposed to highlight opportunity and illuminate risk and help you understand strategy by looking through sort of examining gender and using it as a lens. Again, we invest in women, we use a gender lens for several reasons, right? We use it as a strategic reason, again, to more clearly see risk and opportunity. We also care about gendered impacts and achieving the sustainable development goals, and understand that I think the UN has been pretty clear about this, that gender is one of those goals that cuts across all of the other ones and is sort of a keystone to achieving the rest of the sustainable development goals. We'll skip to the next slide. Excellent. And so about a year ago, we really embarked on a series of events and examination, trying to understand, as Caroline was talking about in the beginning of the slide, why more money wasn't moving with a gender lens and what was holding investors back from integrating gender into their investment strategies. And I'll pause here to just give a quick shout out to Shell Foundation and Heidi. And I don't know if she's on the line right now, but Shell Foundation was our partner in supporting this work and has been really, at the forefront of funding and pushing forward a lot of this gender lens conversation, particularly in the energy space. But so we kicked off this series of events last year to understand why this wasn't happening. And what we found was twofold. Investors were really asking for more quantitative evidence, and quantitative evidence that wasn't just from public markets, right? I think, we've all seen a lot of the studies that have tracked public markets where information is sort of robust and available over decades, showing that gender diversity, particularly at the board and leadership levels, has an impact on performance. But particularly a lot of the investors that we work with and a lot of our borrowers didn't really see themselves in that data. They wanted to see, businesses that looked like the ones they were investing in, or sectors that looked like the ones they were operating in, to really understand that, yes, gender does have a measurable impact in this universe. So that was one piece of just a more diverse and robust quantitative evidence. And the second piece was a lot of confusion, right? And maybe some of you will feel this on the phone, but they felt that they just didn't know where to start, right, in terms of applying a gender lens. A lot of people felt a little bit intimidated by it, that it was a bit overly complicated, or that they needed, a 200-page thesis, or, someone with a PhD in gender studies to do all of this work. And so those two things were really holding people back from applying a gender lens and even beginning to explore it, or even owning the gendered impact that they already had in their investment strategies. And so what we did in it is at the conclusion of this sort of year-long series of events and investigation, as Caroline mentioned, is publish a report called Just Good Investing, which is available on our website, and I'm sure we can send out the link to it afterwards, that really captures a lot of our learnings over the years, as well as guidance for investors in more detail. It has a few tools and frameworks that we'll walk through really quickly that you can explore in greater detail that we developed specifically in response to these two issues for investors. There's also a robust quantitative study of our portfolio over 10 years that shows a demonstrated impact between gender diversity, particularly in leadership, meaning senior leadership at organizations, and financial performance. We're not going to go through that here on the webinar, but happy to take any questions about that later, or point anyone to where that is. But so we'll just walk through briefly some guidance for investors we developed based on our learnings last year. So we'll go to the next slide. So first was really setting just realistic expectations. That's probably a little self-explanatory. And that means a few things. And let's skip to the next slide. And one is that understanding that different capital can do different things. So this was something that we found had really confused the conversation around gender lens investing, is that, people with investment capital and people with grant capital have very different possibilities that capital allows them. And even breaking that down a little bit further, people with investment capital who can only invest in public markets versus private markets, who have debt versus equity, also have different options, and we'll walk through those in a minute. But just broadly, good to understand that not every solution or not every problem has an investable solution, right? And so just really understanding that some things, including really deep sort of social cultural issues that require really tailored solutions, it requires philanthropy. And there are some things that might never move out of philanthropy into being investable, and that's okay. But understanding sort of the range of issues that you can touch on with our investment capital and with philanthropic capital are different. And that means the conversations that you can have around what a gender lens looks like and what considering gender looks like and what the outcomes look like based on those issues that you touch on are also different. So let's skip to the next slide. And so again, we talk about understanding the capital that you have at hand and really understanding the realities of what that capital can do. Again, and not focusing really on your identity, whether you identify as an impact investor or a philanthropist or anything in between, but really understanding, again, what capital do I have? Where is it housed and how much do I have? Again, we talked about the limits of different types of capital. Where is it housed matters as well. So for investors who, again, have their investment assets sitting at, sort of a mainstream financial institution, have a lot less flexibility and ability to get their capital out of those accounts and into opportunities on the ground than people who have, let's say, a family office or, again, philanthropic capital. And again, another key question for investors when placing capital with a gender lens is how much do I have? And that's just sort of the reality of a lot of investment opportunities. The more capital that you have to invest, the wider the world of opportunities is for you, both for reasons of some opportunities are only available to accredited investors. Okay, let's the next slide. And so in response to all of these issues that we've just walked through, we developed what we called an asset class framework for gender lens investing. And this is really just at its most basic an attempt to sort of organize the conversation around gender lens investing. So again, we're talking about, we're setting sort of our expectations and understanding the realities and the bounds that the capital we have has to have gendered impact and gendered outcomes. And so that we're not having, people who sit sort of squarely in this philanthropic column have confused conversations with people who are sitting more in the capital market columns, right? These are just, you can apply sort of different tools to the capital depending on where you're sitting in this framework. so you can expect different outcomes. We found that a lot of the sort of the tension and the confusion in gender lens investing came from people with sitting in different columns here with different types of capital, trying to have the same conversations, or sort of misunderstanding both the realities and the limits of the types of capital that they have. Again, this is in our report, and I'll just pause here. I know it's probably hard to see on the screen, but again, it sort of walks through, it serves as a map. If you can find what type of capital you have or what type of capital you're looking for, then you can really understand sort of, again, what the possibilities are to include gender as part of an investment or a grant strategy going forward. So we'll go forward to the next slide. And again, so this is just a little bit more, again, from our perspective, we invest in private markets. And as I mentioned earlier, we found that people really, in order to sort of move more capital, particularly in the impact investing markets that we operated in, and that a lot of you, I think, are operating in as well, they needed a more tailored business case made. And again, we have this in our report, but we won't spend too much time on it today. They needed one that they could relate to and see themselves in. And second, again, just when you're operating in private markets, I think, a point that we wanted to make is there's a little bit more nuance and possibility for incorporating a gender lens into the investment process. And Nayada is going to walk through this shortly, but just, sort of in comparison to people who are investing in public markets and mutual funds mostly, right, that have a screen that screen in or out companies based on certain gendered metrics, whether it's board participation or leadership participation or other supportive policies that have gendered elements to them. People can screen in and out in public mutual funds and in ETFs and other things like that. But when you have a private market strategy, you have a bit more ability to be a little bit more tailored. We've been investing for around 25 years, and since our founding, we really had been investing in women just by nature of the work that we are doing. Again, investing in communities that have been left behind or overlooked by traditional markets, and by virtue of the sectors we're focusing on, a lot of those people who are left out and have no access to capital are women, right? So I'm thinking specifically of the microfinance and the community development sectors, which we've been investing in for a number of decades. But it was really about 8 years ago where we decided to create a very intentional gender lens strategy. And we've had quite a number of iterations from then, and that is just something that we really like to emphasize for other people who are considering doing a gender lens investing strategy, is that there's no one right way to do it. And it does require sort of constant experimentation and constant iteration, because the markets that we're moving in are working, right? And us as institutions are growing and changing, and we get better and we learn a lot from our gender lens strategies. And so that ability to iterate is really critical. And so and again, around 2012, we launched an initiative called Win-Win, the Women Investing in Women Initiative, where we took a look at our portfolio and we created some screens to include our borrowers in this particular gender-focused portfolio based on a number of metrics, which were, in retrospect, far too restrictive. So it was having, a female CEO, having over 50% of the leadership team as women, and serving 50% or more women as clients. And that was a strategy that we were able to have a sort of robust portfolio around. But what we learned as we did that was that, as I said, the screens were too tight. And so we really learned that by investing in the renewable energy sector. So for example, a lot of the intermediaries and funds that we're investing in the renewable energy sector have an incredibly strong impact on women. And all of you know that's why I won't go through that. But it's not immediately obvious when you look at things like the factors I just mentioned, right? It's not immediately obvious on paper, while a lot of the people whose lives are being transformed by the products and services offered by these companies are women. On paper, they're often not clients. Right, so a company having a tremendous impact on women's lives might have, very few female clients actually show up, and so it was really through this investing in this sector that we learned a lot about how our screens were too restrictive and how our gender lens strategy really wasn't serving us well, and it was causing us to miss really potential high impacts because we had tightened the screens far too much. And I think just overall, what we wanted to share is that, gender it isn't a specific box, right? It isn't a set, right? It's contextual, it's nuanced, it fits across your entire portfolio, whether you recognize it or not. And through our exercise in doing this work, what we'd also found is that there's a massive delta in working with the people who may or may not be aware of what their gendered impact is now. But that doesn't mean they aren't willing to work on it, right? We've had a lot of really powerful impacts working with companies in our portfolio by just helping bring sort of awareness to their own gendered impact and how gender can have an impact on their strategy. And we'll walk through that in the slides to come. So let's move to the next slide. Excellent. So again, this is just sort of from an investor's perspective, and hope that this can be beneficial to the investors on the call as well as those who are looking to sort of understand where and how investors determine their gender lens strategies. So really the strategies the heart of three things, and that is, again, the type of capital that you have, the investable asset, the addressable market, like where can you invest, where's there demand for your capital, where's there need for your capital, and the impact or the sector focus. And in the middle of those three things is really where you can build out and execute on a strategy for more broadly. If we could skip to the next slide. Excellent. And so this is, again, just a little bit more detail about our own strategy, right? We invest senior debt capital. We, as I said, invest really in funds and intermediaries. And specifically here, we're talking about investing in funds and intermediaries in the off-grid sector. And our focus, as an impact focus, to the extent we have one, is on gender equity. And as I said before, we developed screens that were far too tight for serve our purposes of gender lens investing. And so now we operate with three very broad screens. And as I said, we really focus on screening in rather than screening out and working with borrowers over time to improve impact. And our goal is not to create the most pristine portfolio of people who have, the perfect gendered approach right now. It's really to bring this sector up with us and to help, again, improve our borrowers' understanding and actions on this issue. Things that we work with, we look at governance and leadership diversity. We look at commitment to SDG 5, and we look at the organizations and their services, their positive impact on women and their families. And those are sort of, again, very, very broad and intentionally so. And then we look at gender throughout, again, the investment process. We look at gender in our underwriting by asking questions tailored to understanding our borrowers' gendered impact and understanding if they understand their gendered impact. The other tool that we use when working with our borrowers is setting milestones. Again, we don't, sort of kick people out. What we do is we like to work with people that show a willingness to improve on this and then tailor milestones that are appropriate for their context and appropriate for their where they are in their gender strategy at this point right now, and work towards that. We make these milestones both what we call hard and soft, so either baking them formally into the legal agreement that we have with borrowers, or having, even after the legal agreement, a written understanding of goals and milestones. The other place where we incorporate gender is in reporting. So we do ask all of our borrowers for gender disaggregated metrics. And some are able to provide sort of much more detailed metrics than others, but it is something that we do again work with on. We'll go ahead and skip to the next slide. Excellent. So as I said, we do incorporate gender throughout our underwriting and our due diligence. And really this is just, we ask questions in three sort of big basic categories, right? We ask them when we're determining sort of screening and fit. And I'll just pause and say, I realize this is very hard to see. It's, again, why we put the page number on Just Good Investing. Unfortunately, it doesn't fit well onto a PowerPoint slide. But really, again, we're asking questions in key areas around, workplace equity, gender diversity, gender incorporation within mission, within strategy, within execution. As you go through a lot of these questions, you'll see that they're very basic, right? And I think that's another point that we want to make, is that a gender lens investing strategy does not have to be complicated. And because it is so nuanced and contextual, often it just starts with a conversation, right? So one of the questions we ask is, how does gender fit into your strategy and operations, right? And again, the point of this is to not answer every question perfectly, or even that you have to ask every question that's on this list. It is just that you start the conversation and you, again, start to reveal again, things you may or may not, you and your borrower may or may not be fully aware of in terms of their gender lens or their gender influence. The only other thing I'll say about this is that on the left and sort of the reds and pinks is questions that are tailored to investing in intermediaries, again, so people who are then on lending or investing in other businesses. And then in the blue is questions that are tailored to investing in businesses. We can skip to the next slide. Again, so this is just, and as I said, we require gender disaggregated data from all of our borrowers. And this is just a sample, fictitious impact report from a borrower made up for this presentation. But as you can see, we collect, and it's standard to all of Calvert Impact Capital Investing, we collect impact metrics as part of the legal agreement with our borrowers. They're required to report on it yearly. And then again, we bake gendered metrics as appropriate into the reporting process. And we also have on this slide just sample milestones, right? So again, we work with people to help improve, and so we'll ask them to consider adding an additional women board member, an additional woman to the investment committee if those are not particularly gender diverse. Their work right now. Again, having documented HR practices, training, et cetera, and also looking at the client and beneficiary level, right? Trying to collect gender disaggregated data on the client level is, I would say, where we get the biggest pushback from our borrowers, who often find this very challenging, and it very much is, right? But this is another example of where we work with borrowers, where we're patient with borrowers, and where we really try and frame this for their understanding as well, that collecting gender disaggregated data is not for the benefit of us wanting to count the number of women they reach. It's for the benefit of their work and understanding their client base better, who they're serving, how they're serving them, and if there's a market they could potentially be missing. And I would say, just as another global comment that's very important if you're an investor working with borrowers, is to emphasize the business piece of gender inclusion, right? A lot of us are working with very organizations with limited resources who are operating in tough environments and have a number of different demands on their time and resources. And so it is challenging for them to collect this data, but ultimately it's quite powerful for their own businesses to be able to see that and incorporate the data going forward. And we'll walk through 2 examples of that in the next slide. So we'll skip to the next slide. Again, so this is just an example from our portfolio of a borrower we worked with who was very gender diverse, both from a leadership and a client base, but was sort of reluctant to be included or featured as part of our portfolio that had a strong gendered impact. And they really were insistent that they had a sort of gender neutral approach to their work. And we'd ask them to, take a closer look really at gender throughout their operations. Again, they said this was very hard. It would be hard to get the information, so they had planned really a staged effort to collecting more data on their clients. But one thing that they did start looking at the gendered aspect of beyond their leadership team was at their sales staff level. And they noticed in the sales staff data that the women who were employing as sales agents were far outperforming the male sales agents. And so digging into that a little bit more, both anecdotally and with a little more rigor. And what they sort of posited was that women sales agents were able to visit the homes of potential clients when men were not at home, and this enabled them to have a lot more interactions with potential customers and create a different, just a lot more opportunities for sales. And so, sort of digging on this and talking with their sales agents more and trying to understand what was behind that data, they started shifting the way that they did sales, right? And it was to ensure that agents were going to homes at a time when both men and women were home, so they could have the discussion and both make the decision and potentially execute on the sale then. But also, they were really again, it was just enlightening for them to understand that there was this dynamic to their process. they had not seen, right? And so this also understanding sort of who was making the decision and who was the on-paper purchaser, it made for, a quicker sales process for them, and also for a more reliable customer base. People who valued the product, understood it, knew they wanted to use it, and were able to reach out to the right people if they had any questions, comments. And so we'll skip to the next slide. Again, and this is just another example of collecting gender disaggregated data, and a borrower that we worked with who was really interested in the idea of collecting gender disaggregated data, but was convinced that the clients they worked with could not do it, that they would push back, that they wouldn't be able to do it, that they wouldn't understand why. So we worked with them again to set milestones within their loan agreement about collecting gender disaggregated data. And what they started doing to sort of help downstream this process was incorporating gendered questions into their own underwriting process for their borrowers. And again, if you go back to the underwriting framework that we're working through, it would be the questions in blue that they were asking their borrowers sort of throughout the business. And the way that they framed this was, again, that it was a competitive advantage. That this, when it was important for them to understand their borrower's strategy, and again, how much of the market they were seeing, and how well they understood their clients and how to serve them, how to effectively reach and how to effectively serve them. And the other thing that I'll emphasize on this is just that it's a process. The first year that they attempted to collect gender disaggregated data on the ultimate end users of the products, we had very spotty, not much data, right? But when year 2 was much better, right? And now is sort of year 3, the data is quite good, but realizing that it takes time and effort to be able to really execute on this, just patience. And so let's skip to the next slide. Excellent. Okay, so we'll pause there, and just again, looking forward to the questions after this. And as always, feel free to reach out and keep in touch. I think we're in touch with most of you as a member of the conversation. So I will pause there.
Thank you so much, Lee, and thanks for stepping in to do the whole presentation on behalf of both yourself and Nayada. Really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Sorry, we had trouble with her. It would have been great to have both of you, but again, thank you. I have a couple of questions just to kick off, and again, encourage everyone to, if anything comes to mind, to type it into the chat box. But first of all, Lee, just stepping back, right? You've been in this impact investing sector for a good amount of time, and how have you seen the approach to gender evolve over time? We're early movers on that, but have you seen it momentum, and correlated to that, where's the field going next? What are the innovations that you see popping up? Just interested to hear about kind of the trends and where it's been, where it's going.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that's a great question. I think we've seen gender lens investing evolve significantly. I would say about like 7 or 8 years ago, when the term was really coined, and really kudos to Criterion and Jackie Vanderbrug and Suzanne Beagle and a lot of the women and who are doing sort of yeoman's work or who did sort of yeoman's work in really establishing this as a effective strategic practice, and doing the research, writing the papers, having the conversations, bringing people together to create really a community of practice around it. Because again, I think it's something people have practiced without a name for quite some time, but naming it brings a lot of power to it. And just on that point, what I'll say again is that it's not rocket science, and I think people are really intimidated by gender lens investing. And I hope that in recent years, what people have realized again is that it doesn't have to be so complex that it's paralyzing. It really just starts with a conversation and a few simple questions, and then an articulation of your own strategy, and it evolves from there. I think we saw a lot of that when we did our sort of conversations with investors last year, was that, after we walked through these presentations and these tools and had a more open discussion, people said, what, I've been doing this. I know my organization does this. We just haven't been calling it gender lens investing, and we don't talk about it. And that's quite harmful to the field, right? Because the only way that it's going to become a standard practice, and again, as we titled a report, just a part of good investing, not something unique, not something special, not something that's limited to people who have, a dedicated mission to gender equality, is if people start talking about it, like people start talking about it from all different areas along the capital, not just markets, not just private markets, not just philanthropy. So I do think that in recent years, particularly I would say over the past year or two, there's been a real resurgence and interest in gender lens investing and just part of that cultural moment that we're in. And I do think we've seen more people sort of stand up and say, we incorporate gender into our investment process. And I think we've also seen a lot more, investors, more traditional investors, right, paying attention to it and talking about the issue. And I think that's really powerful and important. I also think that, the recent efforts with the DFI collectives around the 2X initiative for gender equality is really important as well, because as you can start moving, sort of large amounts of capital and start baking gender into the, investment underwriting and due diligence of institutions like DFIs, and you can start standards. Set standards in the industry. And overall, really, I think over the past two years or so, there's been quite a resurgence, and I think we've seen a lot of good industry groups and conferences come out of that, and more opportunities to engage for people. So I hope we see a lot more.
Thanks, Lee. I think you're so right. I've seen a lot of people sit up and take notice around that 2X challenge, and it feels like it's coming into the mainstream in a bigger way. At least there's more term, even if I think gender lens is still kind of it takes a little while to get your head around it. Feels jargony, I think, to the uninitiated. But one thing that you have in your report, I was just looking back over it, given your comment here that it's not rocket science, right? Gender lens investing is an art more than a science, and context matters. And so, wondering if you could say a little bit more about, how do you practice that art? Like, what kind of does that mean in terms of how different or maybe organizations such as your own approach things? It's not, for all of the frameworks and the metrics, it really is, it's an art at the end. And then I was just going to link that to, at the same time, we need a strong business case for gender inclusion. And you're saying that some of the companies you talk to, they just haven't seen the hard data that kind of lays out why they should get off the sidelines on this.
Yeah, excellent. And that is a key theme of the report that we'd like to emphasize again and again and again, is that there's no one right way to do it. And again, I think it starts with a conversation, and it starts with understanding the context that our borrowers are operating in, and the context that a lot of your partners might be operating in, right? And I think, where you see this the most strongly in the way that we've adjusted our strategy is moving those screens to be very inclusive, right? So again, we screen in, not screen out. And what we're willing to do is work with people based on both where they are individually as an organization, right? Maybe they've never heard of gender lens investing before. Maybe they've never considered incorporating gender throughout their strategy and operations, but it doesn't mean that they're opposed to it, right? And I think we found that, all of the borrowers that we talk to are always intrigued by anything that will help, improve their business operations, right? And so I think it's important to frame it that way. But what we mean by an art, and rather than a science, really is that, you're going to have to set the strategy and determine what's right for your strategy based on that context, based on your capital, based on your goals, based on where your borrowers are. That there's no threshold that says, okay, this is the right amount of women to have on this board or in this leadership or serving these clients for everyone in this sector or everyone in this, in our portfolio, right, is that we find that it's a much more robust and interesting if you sort of let go of having these like be all end all metrics for what's good and what's not. That what you can do is, again, as we said, really work with borrowers who might not be aware of their gendered impact now, or maybe they have a strong gendered impact, they just don't recognize that it has anything unique or special, so that there's a real opportunity to have a really deep impact if you sort of take an inclusive approach, and again, focus on it being, nuanced, contextual, and more art rather than science. And yes, the quantitative case is really important. That's important for investors, and it's important for the borrowers that we work with as well. Again, right, both, especially the borrowers who have a lot, again, on their plate, they really need to understand and see how this impacts them, and why they should pay attention to it. And I think you can do that with both qualitative stories, like the ones we just told, and sales and operations and the benefits that our borrowers were able to reap by understanding the gendered aspects of their work, as well as sharing some quantitative studies. And again, this is why we did the quantitative study of our own portfolio, because we're able to look at it and say very clearly that the organizations in our portfolio with greater gender diversity outperform those who have less gender diversity. So, it helps to have those types of quantitative pieces that say, it's true. Looking at, and again, our portfolio is global. We looked at a high amount of assets under management. We looked across sectors. Right? So it's a broad study that people can speak to, and I think there's a lot of different data out there. Again, most of it is in public markets and sort of VC private equity worlds, where it's a little bit easier to get the data. So one other just call to action I'd make is for people to share their data, right? Especially in the private markets that we work in, it's harder to get a hold of. And I think people, one, we have to start paying attention to it so we can collect it. And then two, we have to start analyzing it and sharing it more broadly so we can continue to really build the business case from a number of different angles.
I think that's a great call to action, and it resonates. It's really aligned with what we hear ourselves saying as well. It's right. We need the gender disaggregated data. We need to just be collecting it. But an initial step towards that is for people to understand why is it important. We have a question from the audience around how do you bridge the gap between the gender perspective of developed world investors who primary focus may be on like board representation, but then on the other hand, you have developing country experience where they would see gender lens more in the impact on women's lives and livelihoods. And I think right there that gets at the GIN definition that you went through. But the question is, the fundamental principles are the same between those two, right? You want greater gender integration, but how do you get the two groups talking the same language, sort of bridging the gap in terms of investors talking to organizations on the ground?
Yeah, and I think looking at both of those things are important, right? And I also think this all sort of links back to the data that you can get, right? So again, if we're talking about sort of investors who are investing in public markets, they look at board representation and leadership representation and company policies because that's the data that they can get, right? It's hard to go down much deeper than that and to have any link to sort of or livelihoods, lives on the ground. I do think you're exactly right that the fundamental principles are the same. In order to get both groups talking the same language, I think we maybe can go back to that asset class framework, right, and understand that we're having a conversation within sort of the same lane of the and within the sort of the realities and the opportunities for the type of capital that we're discussing, right? And again, making sure that we're talking to investors who have the ability to move capital to address the types of issues, and the lives and the livelihoods on the ground and making sure that we're talking to those people who have the ability to move capital and address those issues, right? I certainly think, at least in our experience, and again, we're working in the impact investing space and with very socially minded and oriented investors, this is a key concern for a lot of investors, women's lives and livelihoods. I will also just say that data, the sort of outcome and output data, is one, it's a little bit more time intensive to gather, right? And it's a little more, it's harder to gather, right? It's harder to measure, it's harder to gather, it's harder to standardize. So oftentimes it's easier for people to start with paying attention to, sort of, let's say, the top end of the business is the leadership and board. But I think both are important, and I think you can work both sort of top down and bottom up. And I think that one sort of engenders a conversation about the other. Again, I think the key part about talking to investors is making sure we understand what kind of capital they have, what the realities of that capital can do, the gendered operations that they're able to incorporate, and then the outcomes that capital might realistically be able to achieve. And I think, if you can sort of organize the conversation in that way and be clear on all aspects in that, you can have a really productive conversation about all aspects of how gender can be incorporated.
So we're close to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you, Lee, if you could, imagine yourself in a totally different pair of shoes if instead of being an investor you were on the other side of kind of the table, and instead you're an organization for whom gender equity is a central part of your mission. You as a strong woman are head of the organization, so you would make it through the screens for women in leadership, etc. But how would you're out in the world running your business, in the energy access space, of course. But how would you go about raising capital? Like, where do you look? Who should you be talking to? What resources, or kind of what? There's so many tools for investors, helping them kind of make sense of the world, but then maybe not so much on the other side. And I wonder if you can kind of just imagine what your process would be like.
Yeah, and that's a great question, Caroline, and I think important perspective for a lot of the people on the call. And what I'll say again is like being very clear about the type of capital that you need, and again, understanding sort of from the investor's perspective what their realities and limitations of that capital are, right? So I think being super clear about the type of capital that you need and how you're going to use it and what you're going to do with it is important. I also think just, having, if we, on one of the slides, the slide that we had walked through about how you sort of create a strategy, really understanding and being able to articulate, to an investor and to, your peers and other people in the ecosystem, why it is that you consider gender and how you do it and how it impacts your business, right? So being able to have a clear sort of articulation of that is important. And again, for at least from, our perspective as investors, important to understanding how you use it strategically, not just, not just as a, not just on a more sort of surface level, but understanding how you actually and why you actually understand gender and how you incorporate that into your strategy. I think in terms of, if the question is a bit like, who are the investors that care about gender lens investing? You can sort of track back through that based on a lot of the industry resources that are out there, like the GIN, and people who are attending these sort of more gender-oriented conferences like the Gender Smart Investing Summit, and work through and see, who are the investors who this is important to, and work back and understand who those people are from there. But I do think, obviously goes without saying that, gender is an important part of the equation, but like a very compelling investment case, otherwise is also really critical as well. So starting with your own business needs first, and making sure you're clear on those and going out to investors from there would be important. And Caroline, maybe we could share the links for the GIN. The GIN had a gender lens investing working group. And again, the GEN is a network for investors. And so there's a list of people on there who really care about gender. There's also the Gender Smart Investing Summit has a good list of people who attended and who spoke and who participated. And again, it really depends on who you're looking for capital from and what type of capital you're looking for. But on our portfolio list on our website, and again, we lend to intermediaries who then on-lend to other businesses. You can sort that by borrowers who have their focus on and emphasis on gender.
Wonderful. We will absolutely include the links. I think you mentioned 3, the GIN Gender Lens Working Group, of course, the link to the Just Good Investing report, and then you mentioned the Gender Smart Investing Summit, which convened late last year and I think is due to convene again in 2020. We are at the end of our time, which is unfortunate only because I think we could go on quite a bit longer. And so it's a really rich discussion, and it's been a wonderful dive deep into kind of this world of impact investing. And let me just thank you, Lee and Nayada, again for walking us through this and kind of helping us be more sophisticated in our understanding of these concepts. So also thank you for everyone who tuned in. Just to let everyone know, the next Accelerator webinar will be held on September 19th. That's one day after our quarterly call. So we have our quarterly member kind of business call on September 18th, which is a Wednesday. And then on the 19th, we'll have a discussion of integrated energy planning based on some recent research put out by colleagues of ours on the electrification side. So mark your calendars and plan to join us. And with that, thank you everyone, and have a great day.